So I think if you guys could all mute yourself, I think I can mute everybody except Charles. That would be awesome. And welcome. Super excited about this talk today. So just,
Yeah, me too.
I'll keep it meaningful and letting people roll in, but we'll kind of get started because we only have about 35 minutes and I'm so excited about this talk today. So what we're talking about is the pursuit of happiness and how flow state creates optimum performance. And this topic is really close to my heart because of, for some of you who don't know me, my name is Christina McGrath. I own my company, Swell Fit Living, which I help people create optimum performance with their health, primarily with helping people have proper personalized nutrition programs, balance their with yoga, and a whole source of recovery topics as well. So I'm really excited about, I get people into optimum performance so they can get into a flow state, or they can excel in their sport. I have a background with teaching snowboarding, rock climbing, mountaineering, and I bike and do all sorts of sports. So it's really, this topic is really close to my heart. So Charles, I'm going to just let you lay it in. And Charles and I, just to let you know, Charles and I met in London and we have just a lot in common. He's an amazing speaker and I'm going to let him take over from here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Christina. So basically, just as a quick bit of background, my background was as a theatre designer first, then a film designer, then a hotel designer. But in between all of that, I've been reading and researching on neuroscience and how designers think, and not just designers, how everybody thinks. And what we're going to talk about today is something called flow state, which was first sort of, I'd say, discovered, or rather than invented, but discovered by a Hungarian professor called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he wrote the book called Flow. Now, this became a very, very important concept, particularly in sports, in painting, in artists, and, you know, almost everybody at some point gets into a flow state. Now, there are some difficulties with getting into it because you need to be able to do some of the things that I'm going to talk about this evening. The first of which is basically looking at the contents of consciousness, as he calls it, the contents of consciousness. Now, what he says is that one of the basic principles of getting into a flow state is being able to control your thoughts and your feelings, which doesn't come very easily. And his basic principle is that we look at it from a phenomenological point of view and from an information theory point of view. Now, I don't want to use any technical terms, but what that means very simply is that basically it's based on events, on what happens. So it's directly interpreting events. It's not just what goes on. And the brain is, of course, a very complex thing. And what he means by consciousness is, or conscious, is that being able to direct the course of our sensations, of our feelings, of our thoughts, and how we do that and how we get control of that is the difficult thing that we have to achieve. And it does involve skill and it does involve challenge. And I'll come to those two concepts a bit later. But what he's talking about is getting our consciousness to what he calls an internally ordered information. So being aware that we have a desire and it is something that we want to accomplish. Now, you have to have the desire, you have to make the goals and make the desire, and then you have to decide on a route to accomplish it. And normally, particularly with sports people, than just achieving their goals. So the object is to go way beyond that. And that's basically intentional, that's intentionality. And it means basically that we're prioritizing how we use our thoughts and how we order our thoughts. So that will be your instincts, your desires, your drives, and to be hungry for that. I mean, hunger is actually a very, very good example because with hunger, it's a very basic core body function that drives an emotion. Now, you don't need to know that that that's what's happening. All you need to know is you feel hungry and you need to satisfy that desire. So it's a question of organizing the hierarchies and the goals, or the hierarchies of the goals. Now, obviously, there's lots and lots and lots of people who do get into what he calls the flow state, and that would be things like heroes, maybe saints even, or artists, poets, elite athletes, all these sorts of people. They sort of demonstrate to us, if you like, that consciousness can be ordered, can be directed, and can be directed towards a goal. Now, with our brains, basically our attention is very, very, very limited, because there's only so much information that we can actually deal with at any time. Now, we've got a lot of techniques for, or our brain has a lot of techniques for dealing with an overload in information. And it does that by, I mean, as we all do, you do it by chunking things together, by grouping things, by stereotyping, by assumptions, by habits, by beliefs. I mean, and then sometimes we use something like symbolic language, and that might be something like maths or abstract concepts. And we do that in order to be able to use the information. Now, the difficulty is that our brains are basically lazy. Well, I know I certainly am lazy. And what it wants to do is it wants to find the simplest, most energy efficient route for thoughts or neural pathways to take. And so it does that by reinforcing certain paths, and those become your habitual thoughts and your beliefs and how you view the whole world. Because all of this is all about how you actually sort of interpret and view the world. Now, so all the information that we allow into our consciousness becomes extremely important, and we have to pay attention to it. So we have to decide what we pay attention to, and that determines the quality or the content of your life. And that's basically the fundamental starting premise that Mihaly actually begins the book with, and explains how the concept of flow works. Now, he's spent 25 or 30 years actually researching on the contents of consciousness. But it's quite interesting here, because this sort of matches in very well with another concept, which is that there are only two things that we can actually control, and one is our attitude and the other is our effort. Now, our attitude is obviously our thinking, and effort is the amount of resources we place to it. And that matches very well with a concept that I'll come to, as I said, a bit later, which is matching skill to challenge. So does this make sense so far? I can't hear anyone, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, sounds good. So, so when you're coming into where attitude and effort matches as well.
Yeah, yeah, they do. Well, those are the only two things that we can actually sort of control. If you boil everything down to the last couple of bits, then it's just how we think and what we do with those thoughts that matters. And that sort of brings to the next big concept, his next big idea, which is psychic, what he calls psychic energy. Now, don't get too afraid of the term. It sounds a little bit new age, but it isn't at all. All he means by psychic energy is basically control of the consciousness. So that means being able to use your energy, your resources, and your effort in order to actually direct where your thoughts are going. So what he's saying is attention selects what they think is relevant, and that's from billions of things that we see, that we sense, that we taste, that we feel every day, every minute, every second. Somehow we have to filter all of that. Now, emotions is one of those filters. But if we can get hold of that, of those inputs and direct them, then we're in the sort of possibility of getting into flow states. And so what we bring into focus increases our awareness. And this, if I'm not mistaken, as I say, Christina, you know much better than me, this is basically what athletes do, is they focus, concentrate, and direct their energy towards one small singular task. And the idea is to incrementally improve that task continuously. So it's one small step at a time, one small step at a time. There's a whole section that we'll talk about maybe in another talk, which is about how you can manipulate and direct and guide the sort of single steps. And that's another special technique also that goes into sports therapy. Yeah.
So the one thing that I did want to mention, I think there's a thing that, you know, we think about with flow state and performance. We think about that we have to be, you know, thinking more or single point of focus more, but it's actually, we talked about it almost the opposite.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really important point actually. It's almost like a paradox, is that you will practice and practice with direction and get better and better and better. And then the flow state comes when you don't use that anymore, when it's automatic, when it's just, and I can't quite get my head around the fact that it's not quite habit and it's not quite sort of perfection, but within and in between all of that, there is something that sort of suddenly gets into the flow state. And I think it comes to a little diagram that I'll come to in a minute, which is just about the sort of the matching of skill and challenge and how that works.
So just with one more thing that I wanted to say, when you said it's not quite habit, but we're developing the skill, so we're creating that skill to a point where I find everything kind of flushes away from what people think about you, what you think about yourself. You're so involved that when that habit becomes more skillful and that you're at that single point of focus, that's where you kind of bridge over.
A single point of focus is absolutely right. And I mean, you've climbed, I've climbed, and you know that sensation you have where you're only in one specific moment. You're nowhere else. There's no past, there's no future. It's just that moment, and you have to concentrate on that moment. And at that moment, you're right at the top end of your skill level, and you're right next to the level at which the challenge is extremely difficult. Now, if you succeed in it, of course, that is the ultimate flow state, is to get into that state. And the only other time that I've ever sort of felt that sort of deep level of, it's almost like meditation, that deep level of concentration is drawing sometimes. Sometimes you draw and all of a sudden just things just take, not aware that you're drawing, you're watching, you're looking, you're seeing, you're feeling, but it doesn't quite sort of, you're not making any effort to do it. And I think you need an enormous amount of skill to be able to get to that level. So the other thing that Mihaly comes to is this terrible circular argument about the self, is that if we have attention and we direct, and it's all directed by the self, then that becomes the sum of all our conscious contents. And then that directs our goals, which then, of course, directs our attention. So the paradox, I think, and I come up against this a lot within the mind or the brain, is that there are many things that are actually circular. Belief is one of the other big things that, you know, beliefs are formed by our actions, but you wouldn't take any action if you didn't believe that you could take the action. So it goes round and round in circles. So that's very difficult. I've got a cute little story that I like to tell anyway, which is about directing attention, and not just attention, but also about purpose and meaning, which is where we're going to gradually get to. Is if you imagine that there are 3 bricklayers and they're working on a cathedral, and the first one that you approach, you say to him, well, you know, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm putting this brick on that brick, and that's my job. You go to the second one, and he says, and you ask him, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm building a wall, and by putting this brick on that brick. But you go to the third one, and he says, no, I'm building a cathedral, and maybe I'm putting brick on brick and building a wall, but I'm building a cathedral. So the point of that story is that then he understands, the third one particularly understands what the ultimate motive is. And that's part of this whole thing about getting into a flow state, is that you need a long-reaching goal and you need short-term, small steps to get towards that goal. So that's where he's getting at. Yeah.
So along those lines, the other thing that with that big single-pointed focus goal, like you're talking about the guy who's building the cathedral, the point that he is building the cathedral is easier for him to get into a flow state, because
Yeah.
even though he does the daily actions to it.
Well, it's because it has meaning.
Yeah.
So because it has meaning, he knows why he's doing it, or he has decided for himself, and that's what Mihaly is getting at, is he has decided for himself why he's doing this, or something. He's told him and accepted it. So he is directing his attention towards a much greater goal than even himself. And that gives him meaning, which then gives him purpose, which then gives him, he's probably a much happier person as a result. But the other thing to look at as well that he looks at too is this other side of things, which he calls psychic entropy, which is, if you like, the opposite of positive thinking. Or and this is, for instance, where you have repetitive negative thoughts that are very, very difficult to shake. And this is partly because the brain wants to make these very strong neural pathways. Unfortunately, some of them are not necessarily very positive, but it loves to take these routes again and again and again because they're energy efficient. I mean, the brain uses, I think, 20% of all the body's oxygen, which is massive, you know. In fact, a chess player, I love this fact, a chess player will be able to use up 10,000 calories in one day just by sitting, because he's using his mind all the time. That's a grandmaster, admittedly, a grandmaster. So anyway, but then so move on just a little bit. So if we go towards, then what he begins to talk about is saying, right, you've got control of your consciousness. You're beginning to practice, to gain the skill, and then there is the challenge. So then the flow comes when you reach what he calls optimal experience. And the way he explains it, and I've got a little diagram, I can't do a screen share, but maybe that makes sense. Right. So as you can see, there's skill going up here, and then there's challenge here. That may be reversed. Is it reversed on the screen? I don't know. And this bit going up here, that is the flow channel, if you like, the flow state. Now, if you've got a lot of skill, but very little challenge, you're going to be fed up, bored, and irritated and annoyed. And that explains why a lot of kids get very bored at school as well, because they've got a lot of skill or a lot of knowledge, or they're clever and they're not being challenged. If you take it the other way, you've got a lot of challenge, but very little skill, then you're very anxious. This is going to be horrendous for you because it takes you way, way, way out of your comfort zone. But somewhere in this middle, even if you're just, say, a tennis player and you're only just getting it over the net, you can still reach a small flow state, let's say, by matching or pushing the challenge and the skill to their optimum levels. Now, in elite athletes or in painters or poets or whatever that might be, that sort of pushing right to the edge of skill and challenge is the flow state. That's where it comes in. Now, it doesn't necessarily happen, but it does mean that there needs to be a lot of training, a lot of repetition, and you have to be very careful with repetition. It's something we'll talk about maybe next week, is that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And that's a problem. So if you're practicing things wrong, you're going to get very good at doing it wrong. And that's no good, of course.
So one of the things I wanted to ask too, there's something that a lot of people talk about like two things, positive and negative stress. And then also, and I know we talked about this with building muscle, and then also kind of the 4% rule.
Oh, yeah. Well, positive and negative stress. There was a brilliant study done. I think it took 30 years to compile the study with the civil service in the UK, where they tried to work out why some people lived longer and some didn't. And what they found, and it was really a huge, extensive study, brilliant study. What they found was that cleaners, for instance, had a shorter life expectancy than, say, a manager. And they wondered, why was that? Part of the reason for that was that the managers or people who had control over the stress were actually much more able to cope with it, to deal with it, and to enjoy it. Whereas, say, for instance, a cleaner, and not necessarily just cleaners, but anyone who has no control over the stress, then they can't escape it, and that sort of demotivates, and that creates negative thoughts and everything else. So, so I think that whole thing about sort of stress is, there's another part to it, which is that in order to build muscle, as you well know, you must push a little bit beyond comfort into a little bit of pain in order to tear the muscle, to rebuild the muscle, and to build strength. Otherwise, nothing changes. So if you exercise but you do the same thing all the time and it doesn't push you, doesn't get you to a higher state of challenge or a higher state of skill, then you will never, ever, ever improve, and you'll never reach this flow state, which is, I mean, it's a blissful state to get into if you can get into it, of course. So, and I think that's what really, what say Olympic athletes do, is that they'll train for years just to shave, half a second off of their time. I mean, what's half a second? And we've wasted thousands of seconds already. But an athlete, an Olympic athlete, it's half a second that makes all the difference between what they want to achieve and what they don't. And the same also, even you hear Usain Bolt, and he said, well, he doesn't really think about his running. When he's running, that's it. He's just in the zone. There's nothing else. And all time sort of fades away. And that's a really interesting sort of feeling. So I think particularly with, not just with athletes, I mean, it can be anything. I really mean it can be anything. It can be any type of skill that you use that challenges you, that you feel you can just about accomplish. And so the challenge is always to improve, to get better. And even when you're the best, they still have to get, I mean, Federer doesn't give up trying to be the best, does he? Yeah. So what he's saying, what flow is all about is when you're able to organize your consciousness so that you can experience flow, then the quality of your life improves because, and this is going back to what we talked about, the bricklayers, is that then you have a goal, which then gives you a meaning and gives you a purpose. And with meaning and purpose, then you're pretty much on the right path to actually finding a reason to actually be doing anything at all, and hopefully getting yourself into a flow state. So, so in flow, sort of almost everything we do adds more order to the consciousness. And I think that's why some people that we've seen who appear to be really sort of in the zone, I find that an easier term than flow, but in the zone, they are very, very focused, very clear. Their thinking is clear. I mean, there have been, in fact, there was a goal I think it was by Wayne Rooney, where he just flipped a ball. He cannot possibly have thought about it. He flipped a ball over his head, turned around and kicked it straight in the goal. You just can't imagine that. You can't think that. You just have to do it. And that brings us to one of the really, really, really important points, is that you can't think it. You have to do it. And that's crucial in any flow state. It is about the doing of it. It's not the thinking about it that really, really counts. And I reckon you can get into that state with almost any skill that you develop. I mean, be it piano playing, or be it a violinist, or be it playing squash, or playing tennis, or whatever it might be. I think that gives you, and that sort of justifies why people love doing sport, because it gets them closer or into a zone. I mean, I know, and I'm sure you know as well, Christina, probably better than me, unfortunately, that when you're on a mountain, when you're skiing, then you're looking at the mountain, you're about to go down, but the minute you start, that's it. Everything else fades away and disappears, and it's only the moment in front of you that actually counts. And that's the joy of it. I mean, that really is the joy, I think. So, and the other thing that he says is that that excellence is actually a process of evolution. It's not a static thing. It's not a point. So it's not something that you say, right, that's it. That's all I want to get to. That's the best bit. It's actually evolution, and it's cumulative and learning, and it's incremental improvement. So it's this constant sort of overlapping. So I don't know whether it be Fosbury or Usain Bolt or whatever, once they've done it, then they still want to go further and still do better and still do more. So that gives everything purpose. And the battle, I think, for all of us really is the struggle with ourselves and establishing that control and that level of attention, which I think is really, really, really difficult to actually sort of direct the contents of consciousness, is what he calls it anyway. So there are 2 or 3 other big ideas within the whole sort of flow states, and based on all his research, is that one thing that again is paradoxical in a sense is that he says that it gets more complex as you progress. Now, I can sort of understand it because you have more skills, so you know more, so you can do more, so it becomes more complex. But what flow helps you to do is to integrate and differentiate, and that allows much deeper concentration. So you decide what's in, what's out, what you want and what you don't want. And that means that consciousness gets unusually well ordered, basically. You get it sort of into the bubble, into the zone. But it's very difficult to do because it's thoughts, intentions, feelings, and, you know, we've all grown up with sort of very complex emotions that don't necessarily do everything we want them to do. And some of them are quite, dare I say, animalistic. So, of course, they propose other things than the thing that we want them to do. And that's why he says also that you have to decide what the intentions are. And if you can work out, if you can prioritize your attention, your intentions, then you will gain better control over attention and then get into this flow state. Right, so a little quote from him is when we choose a goal and invest in ourselves, and we invest in ourselves in it, to the limits of concentration, whatever we do will be enjoyable and rewarding. And I think that everybody's felt, I mean, driving a car even. Here's another stupid example. I don't know if he's listening now. Is a friend of mine took me to a racetrack, and he races classic cars. And he said, right, off you go, get in. And I was absolutely terrified. But after about the 3rd or 4th lap, then that terror was suddenly turning into, yes, I get this, I know this. That's where the skill began to meet the challenge. And then you get into this deep consciousness where you know when you're meant to be doing it, and you're getting to the optimum. Optimal for me was nothing like anybody else, by the way. I was much slower than everybody else. But it was that sort of wonderful, sort of deep feeling of pleasure and that flow state. So past and present didn't matter. You know, at that moment, I'm in the car and I'm racing, and that's it. And it was great. So another sort of part of this is just small marginal gains that we spoke about a little bit earlier. Is that there's the quote, this is actually from somebody else completely, which is, I've got the book here somewhere. It's a book called Legacy, about the All Blacks, who were sort of sporting heroes. He says, if you can get 100 things done 1% better, you will deliver a cumulative advantage. So, and that was the policy that the All Blacks used to have. Unfortunately, they have lost their crown, but they did have that incremental policy. And that's another concept that perhaps when we've got time we can talk about, which is this concept of Kaizen, which is very small improvements in as many different areas as possible. And that really is the other part that makes, that's more for organizations, I would say. And certainly applicable to sports as well, particularly sports teams. So
in summary, like, what are some of the kind of, I know we've talked a lot about different, how to, like you just kind of described, how to do little incremental changes to increase our skill level and test our boundaries a little bit. Getting out of our mind, obviously, a little bit more with more helpful thoughts than the negative ones. And then also what were a few of the other ones that maybe we can really like tangibly take home today and try them
Yeah.
with little things that we
Okay,
do?
so there are two big strategies, two really big strategies. And one is that you have to make the external conditions match your goals. So that's the first one, and that might need a bit of explanation, but I'll come back to it. And then we have to change how we experience external conditions. Now, and that, to be honest, that I think that's a very simple concept, because if you imagine that you want to, if you view everything with a positive framework, then the world will seem to be more positive. If you view it negatively, the world will seem more negative. There was another interesting experiment which was done in America somewhere, Stanford, I think, is that they asked students to force themselves to smile for a day. And then they judged, and they had some criteria for judging whether they felt happier or unhappier. And at the end of the day, although they said their cheeks ached, they said they all felt happier because they were smiling. Now, the logic behind that is that the physical actions of raising and compressing the muscles of your face sends a signal to your nervous system that says, oh, hang on, something's making me squish up my face. I must be happy, I must be smiling. And therefore, everybody felt afterwards, the emotion that they felt afterwards was triggered by the physicality of it. So that's about how you experience things, and that's about mindset, how you view the world. And of course, the famous quote from Earl Nightingale is that we become what we think about. So if you think negative thoughts all day, every day, then what happens is the world is terribly negative. But if you build the right kind of criteria for thinking, what Mihaly calls the contents of consciousness, and you gain control over that, then you can change how you think and how you can achieve optimal performance. So he says also that happiness isn't just, we're running out of time, aren't we? We're nearly there. Anyway, happiness isn't just experiencing pleasure, because I think, yeah, to bring it back to happiness, what he says, and I completely agree with him, he says happiness is not something that you pursue, it ensues. And it ensues by what you do and how you view the world. So the pursuit of happiness is wrong, basically. And I don't want to undermine the whole of the was it the Gettysburg Address? No, it wasn't. It's the Constitution. The pursuit of happiness is the wrong thing to look for. And I think that's one of the problems. So the more things you buy to get, it won't make you happy. What you need to do is to do the right things, and the right things with your mental energies and mental faculties and your physicality, in order to get yourself to have experiences that then will engender happiness. So, and that I think is also very closely related to meaning and purpose. And for me, purpose is absolutely everything. If you've got something that you want to do, you're more likely to be happy than if you don't. And if that gives your life meaning, well, there you are, you're the winner at the end of the day. So all challenge requires skill. You have to have skill to meet a challenge, to get into a flow state. There's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other concepts within it, but those are the sort of the main chunky ones. But it all comes down to attitude and effort. Is that you need to control your attitude, and you need to decide how much resources you put towards achieving that sort of attitude. So there we are. Yay. That's it. Bang on time. Look at that. Amazing.
That was brilliant, Charles. I'm so excited. So we got everybody on here. So yeah, I think you wrapped it up beautifully. And we have, just for all of you out there, I so appreciate you talking about that, Charles. We've been talking about it for the last couple of weeks. I love this topic. We have a lot more to discuss on flow and purpose, and also incremental marginal gains and different things like that. We will be doing a talk every week. We'll do another talk next week, and we are going to get the New Zealand guys involved in it. And we'll be, Charles and I will both be sending out invitations, and I will have a recording of this if you want to share it with anybody. So please let me know. But next week, if you want to write this down, it's Thursday again, 2 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I think it'll be 11 a.m. New Zealand time and 9 p.m. London time. And yeah, and we'll be talking about, what is our topic next week? Oh,
what we'll talk about is deliberate practice,
yeah,
which is also a concept that has been developed with sports as much as with business, but it's how to direct the right kind of effort, the right kind of practice in order to achieve optimal results.
Yay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody for joining us. And yeah, thank you so much. And I'll just sign off, and then hopefully we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah, see you all.
Thank
Cheers.
you.